Hello, everyone. I am Boris Ochoa-Tocachi, a research associate at Imperial College London. It is a pleasure to be here in this session of social hydrology and water availability, and I'm going to share with you a study that we made on the returns on investment for water funds. So please let me share my screen with you. We studied water funds as science policy economy catalyzers. I want to acknowledge the contributions of my colleagues from Atuk Consultoría Estratégica, the Water Protection Fund of Quito, FONAG, the Water Utility Company of Quito, EPMAPS, and Imperial College London. What you can see here in this beautiful picture, this is the Antisana volcano, one of the water sources of Quito, the capital of Ecuador. And you can also see here a wetland that is located in the valley of this volcano. This wetland has been used for centuries for grazing activities, including the creation of artificial canals to drain it, to convert it into rangeland. So one of the activities that the Water Fund is doing is restoring this wetland, but by blocking these artificial canals to retain the water and enhance the hydrological regulation capacity. This is an example of the activities that the Water Fund does in the natural ecosystems in the area. So, we as engineers, we have different types of infrastructure to ensure water availability and to increase water security. One type of infrastructure is what we call the gray infrastructure. So these are dams, reservoirs, canals, and other concrete-based infrastructure. But there is this other type that is a recent concept of green infrastructure. So green infrastructure is a strategically planned network of elements that tries to use or mimic natural processes and have the same benefits than gray infrastructure would provide. But the scenario is not gray versus green. It is something like this, a combination between these two types that provide some benefit. When this infrastructure deals specifically with water, then we get what we call blue infrastructure. There is a particular and very interesting type of this type of infrastructure that is called rural technologies. For example, in the Andes, water harvesting methods or ancient technologies that have been used for centuries. So this set is what we call the built infrastructure. But there is also another group of infrastructure for water security, and it is the natural infrastructure. Natural infrastructure is the forests, grasslands, wetlands, soils, streams, and all the other ecosystem elements that make a watershed. This is the focus of the Water Fund in making interventions that can increase or conserve the ecosystem services provided by the ecosystems. And we as researchers, what we do is we want to test the effectiveness of these interventions on the natural infrastructure. The intervention area of the Water Fund, FONAG, and the Water Utility Company of Quito, EPMAPS, is Quito, the capital, and the surrounding areas. As you can see here in the pink polygons, the settlements and the basins that are around, with a total interest area of almost 700,000 hectares. From these, around 80,000 hectares are protected under the National Protected Areas system of the state. An additional 155,000 hectares is the priority intervention area of the Water Fund. This is where the water abstraction points are located for water supply and for electric generation. There are some areas also that were bought by the water utility and the Water Fund to make them water conservation areas on their own. There is also a conservation agreement between local communities and the Water Fund to conserve these areas at the same time as fostering sustainable development of these communities. There is also a water conservation area of the National Water Authority of Ecuador, SENAGUA, and more recently, another water conservation area that was acquired by the Water Fund. So this is the spatial setting of the Water Fund of Quito, FONAG. But what are water funds really? So water funds are devised as long-term financial mechanisms to invest in a portfolio of watershed interventions. The aim is to ensure water availability for a diverse set of stakeholders. So these stakeholders contribute to a common fund, And this common pool of resources is invested in a portfolio of interventions. Some of these interventions are direct, for example, conservation or restoration activities. Some of these interventions are indirect, so environmental education, capacity building, etc., that probably they don't act directly in the ecosystem, but in the people that live in the ecosystem. And there are some supporting activities, for example, human resources, monitoring, etc., that are necessary for the others to work. So the complete set of interventions produce an impact on water quantity and quality that also brings economic benefits. They also have a cost, right? So the relationship between the net benefits and the investments in the interventions is what we use to calculate the return on investment. As a water fund involves multiple stakeholders, the return on investment for the water fund include the net benefits of the complete set of stakeholders over their total investments. For example, for the Water Fund of Quito, this is the water utility company, the electric company, 2 private bottling companies, the NGO TNC, and the consortium Camarena. But the net benefits of each of these stakeholders is not calculated in the same way. So the return on investment for each stakeholder can be estimated from their individual net benefits over their individual investments in the water fund. And this is what we did. For the 2 main stakeholders of the water fund, as you can see here, 86% of the budget is contributed by the water utility company and 11% of the budget is contributed by the electric generation company. So we calculated the return on investment for these 2 as an estimation of the total return on investment for the water fund. What is the methodological procedure for this? What we consider is how water quantity and water quality are changing in time. So if we are in point A at the moment 1, we consider a business as usual scenario. So the characteristics of water quantity and water quality are going to worsen under a business as usual scenario. For example, an increase in the agricultural frontier or grazing activities taking more land, deforestation, for example. If we consider the interventions that the Water Fund does as a sustainable ecosystem management scenario, we expect a better performance. Probably it is not going to be as good as the original, but it's going to be at least better than the characteristics that we would get under a business as usual scenario. And these characteristics of water quantity and quality will be associated to a cost. For example, a worsened water quality is going to increase water treatment costs, or having more water is going to increase the cost because of the quantity, but also the income because of economy of scale. So then we make a relationship between the time and the costs, and we expect to see something like this. Under a business as usual scenario, the costs are going to increase, but under a sustainable ecosystem management, they are going to increase, but probably not as much. The difference between the 2 scenarios is what we consider the net benefit, the difference in costs between the business as usual scenario and the sustainable ecosystem management scenario. We made hydrological modeling in order to estimate what are these benefits going to be in the future under these different scenarios. So for the baseline, we calibrated the model and then we estimated what would happen in the business as usual without the interventions of the water fund, and in the sustainable ecosystem management with the interventions of the water fund. And we had results something like this. For example, for water quality, as you can see in the black line, the current scenario, under a business as usual, the water quality is going to worsen, probably not by that much. But under a sustainable ecosystem management, water quality is going to improve. Now, this is important. If the water quality improves below a threshold, or it is better than the norm, then this is going to produce a change in water costs, in water production costs. If the gains are not as good as the norm, or they don't cross a threshold, then probably even though we can improve water quality, this is not necessarily going to be a benefit. In the case of water quantity, this is more a continuum. So as you can see, we don't necessarily have a larger water yield in the sustainable ecosystem management than in the baseline. But these marginal benefits are going to give us more water to produce and to commercialize in the case of the water utility company, for example. But what we can also see here is that in the business as usual scenario, water quantity is expected to reduce because of increased agricultural practices, for example. The benefit here in this case is the avoided losses between the business as usual scenario and the sustainable ecosystem management scenario as well. So for the water utility company, what we did is we understood how the water treatment processes from the abstraction to the plants and to the distribution and how they share water between these different plants. We found that there is no significant relationship in this case between water quality and the costs, because the water protocol for treating water doesn't necessarily consider these differences, or there are thresholds that cannot be crossed in the improvements of water quality. But what we found is that there is a significant relationship between the water quantity and the costs. And we use that relationship to estimate what are the differences between the two scenarios. So the income and the cost that we would get under the sustainable ecosystem management and under the business as usual scenario is what we use to calculate the net benefits. So for the water utility company, we estimated a return on investment of $1.71. That means that for each dollar that the water utility company puts in the water fund, they recover the dollar and they get 71 cents extra. For the electric company, the scenario was a bit different. Right. So because this is not a consumptive process. So they use the water, they generate electricity, and then they discharge the water. And this goes, for example, again to the water utility to be used. Or there is this series of cascades of centrals that use and reuse the water in generating electricity. So what we found here is a relationship between river flow and electric generation in order to know how the excedents in water supply are going to also be a benefit in generating electricity, and also the cost of generating that electricity. As you know, some of these centrals might be more expensive to produce than others, and this is also going to have an effect on how an increasing water quantity and water availability is going to change the economic benefit. So what we did between the sustainable ecosystem management and the business as usual scenario, we calculated how the excedents of water are going to increase the income of production, but also how they are going to reduce the costs. And this is what we use to calculate the net benefits in the case of the electric company. So for the electric company of Quito, the return on investment is estimated in $3.66. So it means that for each dollar that the electric company invests in the water fund, they get that dollar back and they get an extra $2.66. So these are very positive results. Both of them have positive returns on investment, but it also proves that having individual interventions from each of these institutions is not going to be as effective as having them combined in a water fund. So the effects can multiply when institutions collaborate, when multiple stakeholders come together and invest in solutions also together. There are many things to still look at. For example, a trade-off between ecosystem services, benefits and compromises between the different stakeholders in these different competitive water-related scenarios, for example. But what we think is that this is an example of how multiple stakeholders can cooperate and can share solutions for water-related problems. I leave the contact details here. Again, I want to acknowledge the contributions of Atuk, Consultoría Estratégica, the Water Fund of Quito, FONAG, the Water Utility of Company of Quito, EPMAPS, and Imperial College London. I just want to say thank you very much for listening. I will see you in the live session on the 15th of December, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you soon.